Hi everyone, welcome to After Dark Analysis. Today is going to be part 2 of our look at the Satanic Panic, and we're going to be specifically focusing in on Dungeons & Dragons. We are going to start out in 1982 with possibly the greatest film ever made, Mazes and Monsters, starring Tom Hanks. Bound together by a desire to play Mazes and Monsters, Robbie and his 3 college classmates decide to move a board game into the local legendary cavern. Due to the title and the movie plot itself, it's obvious this is a take on Dungeons & Dragons, which will become a staple whipping boy of the Satanic Panic from here on out. For those of you that might not be familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, it is a tabletop role-playing game, or an RPG, with pencils and paper instead of a video game, which I know a lot of people associate now with RPGs. Mazes and Monsters focuses heavily on the idea that yes, these role-playing games allow people to kind of act out their issues in the guise of another character in kind of a safe space, but lines eventually may blur between fantasy and reality. The film initially focuses on JJ, Kate, and Daniel. Robbie comes in later, who's played by Tom Hanks. All we know about Robbie when he first comes in is both of his parents keep saying no games. Robbie meets JJ, who's a 16-year-old sophomore. Robbie gets invited to a party at JJ's dorm, and they all meet. They find out he's 9th level and really push for him to become their 4th player. Robbie and Kate begin dating, and kind of soon after, JJ has a little bit of a breakdown. It didn't seem like he was interested in Kate in that way. It was more all of his friends are starting to develop these relationships and kind of come into adulthood, whereas he's 16 and can't quite get there just yet. He actually talks about killing himself inside of these caverns on campus, goes there and realizes they should play Mazes and Monsters in there because it would create a better atmosphere. So essentially they're moving from playing a tabletop game to something closer to LARPing. And for those that don't know what LARPing is, it stands for live action role playing. This is where Robbie starts to come a little unhinged. When they're playing in the cavern, he slays the monster, but he's upset because he didn't use his magic. In games like this, alignment and character are very important, so you want to always act in a way that your character would. Him doing that breaks his character's need to be holy. It extends so much into his life that he starts acting completely as his character and essentially breaks up with Kate because he can't touch her. Even though he says he loves her and has been physical with her in the past, he has to regain his holiness. He's getting these ideas through incredibly vivid dreams he's been having that he's starting to mix up with reality. He eventually runs away to try and find the quote-unquote Great Hall. Eventually his friends put it together that Robbie's brother who went missing's name was Hall. It's also alluded to that his brother's disappearance may have been what caused the breakdown he had before the movie even began. So he ends up in New York looking for the Great Hall. They're able to piece everything together through Purdue's eyes, which is Robbie's character. He keeps seeing human beings as monsters and eventually meets a homeless man in the kind of sewer system. He bows to him and he talks to him as this great ruler because in his head that's what this guy is. When he mentions the Great Hall, the guy assumes he's talking about the Twin Towers. His friends are able to figure out it's probably the Twin Towers as well. They end up there on the roof where Robbie is completely convinced that he can fly. They play along with the delusion just enough to get him down. Because the only reason they even found out he was in New York is he called Kate at one point during a lucid moment saying, I have a knife with blood on it and there's blood on my hands. This isn't a good thing. The film ends up concluding with Robbie going back home and Kate, JJ, and Daniel coming to visit him. The mother talks about how she doesn't blame anybody for what happened to Robbie. She says she thought the game was an outlet and he was just too fragile to handle it. He is still very much in his delusion of being Purdue. So they end up playing and talk about how there's this fine line between reality and fantasy, which has always kind of been the big talking point of entertainment. In all fairness to the film, it was based off a novel of the same name, And the novel was based off rumors that had stemmed from a very real-life incident of James Dallas Egbert III. He was known to play Dungeons & Dragons and was also known to go into the steam tunnels. People thought he had gone into the steam tunnels to play a game of Dungeons & Dragons. It was later revealed he actually went into the steam tunnels that day to attempt suicide. He was unsuccessful, but instead of going home, he hid out at various friends' houses for weeks on end. So there was this massive media storm around the missing Michigan State University student. From that, urban legends evolved of people going into the steam tunnels to play Dungeons & Dragons and becoming lost and dying of starvation, hypothermia, exposure, dehydration, and things of that nature. This unfortunately all hit when role-playing games were still very much in their infancy, because this was all in the late 70s. So the public did not have the knowledge they now do, whether they wanted to or not, about role-playing games. Because even if you haven't played one or aren't interested in a tabletop RPG, you've probably seen some reference to it somewhere in pop culture. It had its own animated show. There's been plenty of movies based off Dungeons & Dragons, including this one, as well as shows like Community, Freaks and Geeks. I think Big Bang Theory maybe even had an episode about it. People are somewhat familiar that this is a thing, much more so than they were back in the late 70s. Yes, there are people in this world that can't distinguish the two. If we look at something like the book Catcher in the Rye, arguably the most famous connection it had was Mark David Chapman shooting John Lennon, where he just sat down and started reading it after. The copy of the book he had on him at the scene had written in it, "This is my statement," written out by Chapman, but he signed it with Holden's name. It was even theorized that the reason the book inspired the shooting is he wanted to maintain and preserve Lennon's innocence. Like the children in the book, even though Holden later pointed out that kids should be left alone. A copy was also found in John Hinckley Jr.'s hotel room after his assassination attempt of Ronald Reagan. These instances, all having this one connection, has caused this book to be banned in several locations, among a lot of controversy, because again, trying to figure out what may or may not set somebody off is impossible, and it's not something most people can legislate on, at least without it tiptoeing into a Minority Report type situation. Speaking of having issues distinguishing reality from fiction, one of these unfortunate cases was the suicide of Irving Pulling. His suicide led his mother, Patricia A. Pulling, to form the organization BADD, B-A-D-D, which stood for Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons. She sent on a mission to attempt to warn parents that she believed this game encouraged devil worship, suicide, blasphemy, demonology, witchcraft, voodoo, murder, rape, assassination, insanity, sex perversion. The list goes on. While this organization did get a lot of media attention, they didn't seem to have much legal success. The only thing that really came about was the American Association for Suicidology, U.S. Center for Disease Control, and Health and Welfare Canada all eventually concluded that there was no causal link between fantasy gaming and suicide. So we're going to see as we kind of go on with this that a lot of the things she was saying this encouraged ended up being culturally what people in the Satanic Panic thought it encouraged. This concludes part 1 of our look at the Satanic Panic of the 80s. If you like what you're hearing, please hit like, comment, subscribe. If you don't like what you're hearing, please feel free to leave me a comment. Let me know. Thank you.